All right. Welcome back and happy Tuesday, everybody, to another Learning Tech Talks where we are exploring, I'm just going to start saying all things learning and workplace technology transformation. I don't know. I haven't come up with a new catchline for it. But I'm excited for this because for a lot of reasons, and I may say that every week, but this time is probably more than ever. This is actually the last official live stream I'm going to be doing in 2022. Taking a little bit of a break, but I do have some content pre-recorded. You should have seen those go out last night for some of the ones that are coming up. This is the last live one. So if you have questions today, bring them. Like, bring your questions live because I'm gonna be a little bit off air for a bit. But to navigate this conversation, I'm also really excited about the conversation I'm about to have because I'm joined by Japman Bajaj, and he's from Vametric. We're going to be talking about capability and skill assessment. And I am very excited about this because the conversation in learning and development, we talk about skills so much. Actually, everyone's talking about skills so much, but it's still very much up in the ether. And so, Japman, I'm looking forward to this. Thank you for joining me and being so flexible too, because I know we had to move the show around to actually get you in before I took some time away.
Absolutely. Well, family comes first. Happy to be flexible. And thanks for doing this, man. I'm happy to be here. Yeah. I'm really excited to be here. I've watched a number of the episodes, so I feel like I'm either super ready for what's about to come or I've just over prepared. And then you just had a call to all the listeners, all the watchers to put all sorts of questions. It's like, you're going to grill me today.
I know.
It's good. It's good.
Come bring them on. I know. Well, that's how I roll. It's a very intimidating show. I know people are very intimidating. I'm a very intimidating person. People would usually just buckets of sweat as we get going. And for those of you who are just joining, I would love to hear where you're joining from. But Japman, where are you in the world right now? Just so people have a little bit of context, because you got this virtual background. I can't tell if it's night or day or what.
Fair enough. It's actually it's the joys of remote working. I've and in fact, for the listeners at home, you may or may not hear some hammering coming from the office upstairs. But we are in
hammering.
We are in snowy, cold, but also amazingly wonderful Toronto, Ontario. Up in Canada, which, by the way, Chris, as you know, you are an honorary Canadian based on where you sit geographically. So, you're feeling the same thing. But I'm a good old Canadian boy.
Good old Canadian. So you also know it's going to be a very friendly conversation because you've got a Midwesterner and a Canadian going back and forth.
We get passionate, though.
We do, right? I'm friendly, but I get very passionate. And this is going to be a very passionate topic. All right. So you're in Canada. You can see my background has not changed. For those of you who have watched, probably like, does he ever get out of that chair? I do, I promise. But the background is always the same. And it is real. See, that's right. That's the real deal right there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit let's start with your journey in terms of how did you end up leading a company focused on learning, capability, and assessment? Like, was that a childhood dream you had once?
Yeah, well, Chris, I was born in 1986. We'll go all the way back.
We're gonna go all the way back,
all the way back. But it's sort of part of the story, right? My parents are immigrants to Canada. They came about 50 plus years ago, so been here a long time. Worked their butts off, and we saw a lot of that growing up. We saw the work ethic, we saw all of that, and lots of families have been through that story. And grew up and sort of discovered entrepreneurship towards sort of university. And I studied finance, and I always sort of thought, I'll work in finance. I'll work on Wall Street for a few years, and then I'll come back to Canada and just make my money and retire quietly.
Go build, make tons of money in the stock market, and then retire back to Canada. That was the plan.
Yeah, that was the big plan. Now here was the big sort of wrinkle in the plan. I graduated with a finance degree in about 2008. I don't know if your listeners remember what 2008 was like for finance.
If I remember right, it was a fantastic year in finance. I think the
Just
market
amazing.
was booming. The housing market was skyrocketing. I think, or maybe it's the opposite. I can't remember.
Yeah. And I call out, it wasn't too long after 9/11, and this whole thing was still sort of, people were still figuring the whole thing out.
Oh gosh.
So
right.
Yeah. So finance, and luckily I had sort of landed in entrepreneurship before I decided to go pursue a true career in finance. And so my first company was largely focused in the post-secondary space. Learned a lot about education and built a nice little enterprise, and spent a lot of time talking to colleges, universities, large government, healthcare as well, but really understanding the business of education. And I think that was sort of where the bug sort of hit. I mean, I've always been involved with educational things. I just never really saw it that way. So anyways, that was my first bite into education. I ended up, after, exiting that company, and ended up spending 5 years in corporate. And this talent and skills problem sort of just kept popping up, right? I was an executive at a company called TELUS, sort of the Verizon of the North, if you will, large player in telecommunications. And had a lot of people-focused programs in my role, in terms of bringing accessibility and technology to disadvantaged people, and some remarkable programs that they do. And then my second corporate stint in cloud and data and, big tech type of thing, just seeing the crazy labor shortages and sort of this idea that labor was really in demand of their careers in tech. So when Vametric sort of found me,
which is interesting about that, because I think some of this conversation about what's happening in the labor markets and talent shortages and the skills crisis and all of this, in some of the conversations I've had, for some folks, there's a perception that this is a relatively new thing. Like this just started happening a couple years ago. And the reality is, and I think you just highlighted this really well, this has been coming like a freight train for a while now. And I think your experience just highlights the fact that this isn't something that in 2020 we suddenly went, oh, we've got an issue on our hands.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right. Like, I mean, if we were societally better planners, we would have gotten ahead of this a little bit more. And that's okay. I mean, at the end of the day, we're a species that survives, but yeah, you're right. This problem has been around for a while, and the next 10 years are going to be super critical as Canadian and American, North American, regional, global societies as to how we figure out what to do with people. Coming out of the pandemic, and not to make it a sort of softy conversation around that stuff, but like, I mean, really, people are looking for value, meaning, purpose, passion, generically, whether that be remote, hybrid, or whatever. That stuff is fine. But I think really at the core, people
that's
are
just
looking
the how, honestly.
That's right. Like the what is like, people are looking to be valued, and people are looking to do valuable things. And, I feel really fortunate. I mean, this is for all the things that I've done before in my life. And there's been a lot of really cool global and domestic and whatever corporate experiences and all that. This is the first time in my life I wake up every day being super jazzed about what we do, because I know we're not only, transforming organizations and employers, but we're changing lives. Like, people's lives are getting better because of the work that we do. And it's super exciting, super, super exciting to me.
And I have a follow-up question to this. But I think this is one of the things that does sometimes get missed when we have the skills conversation. And why does this matter? I think there's a lot of talk about how big of a thing it is, the tentacles that it has in organizations, the changes that are required. We talk a lot about the work associated with it, but sometimes it's missed. Like, why is this so meaningful? Like, why do we even care to go through this? Because if it's not that meaningful, it is easy to look at the work and go, oh, that's a lot of work but if you truly understand, which we'll get into, so I don't want to spoil that one yet, because I think hopefully we're going to illuminate this. But so we've talked a little bit about this. Then how do you describe what Vametric is? We talked about skills and but when people say, so you decided to leave Wall Street, do this, you found your ties, and now you went into it. How do you describe it?
Yeah, I left the cushy corporate to go build something. Vametric is frankly, it's the most accommodating and most inclusive platform in the world when it comes to skills development. What we do is legally defensible learning, and we do that sort of applying the rigor of like audit and compliance. So for us, it's not enough. We sort of say assessment is the critical gatekeeper to whether or not people maximize their potential, which obviously is super meaningful for organizations and employers, right? They want to make the most. I have all sorts of analogies. I'm sure we'll get to all of them. But assessment is largely assumption, right? If you pass enough multiple choice exams, we assume you've got some knowledge. And
if you watch enough stuff.
Yeah. If you're really good at interviews, we assume you're good at a job. I mean, I always sort of jokingly say I can interview the pants off of anybody, right? But that does not mean I know anything. Like, that doesn't mean I'm good at my job. It just means I'm a really good interviewer. And
Which is interesting you bring that up, because when you think about this, even the things we coach and development people on for interviewing and nailing the job have nothing to do with the job itself. A lot of times we coach people on how to do this. So to your point, it's like you can be a fantastic interviewer and be completely incompetent in the job you're hired into.
There's a lot of risk laden in all of that, right? Because when you start bringing assumption into what, most organizations will say stuff like people are our greatest asset. Well, if your greatest asset has been measured using a whole ton of assumption, I mean, look, I studied finance so I can understand compound risk. That's compound risk, every single person. Right?
You mean that's not how companies do corporate finance? Just on gut feel and assumptions?
Well, I guess this is a whole debate of should versus, is. But there are better ways. And I think that's what we get really excited about, right? Is that there are better ways to manage that great quick analogy, right? For most of us, our home is our greatest asset, right? So I know exactly where all the, I know how to jiggle the sink faucet to get hot water to come out. I know how to shake the string on my blinds to make sure it closes, right? I don't think organizations, corporations, employers, I don't think they know where their creaky floors are in their greatest asset. I don't think they understand what the values and opportunities and weaknesses of their people force is, because they've never been given a real true mechanism to do that. And we do that, right? And that's where, again, I get super excited about not just the individual, which is super meaningful, the individual opportunities for people, the systemic opportunity for change at large scale.
Yeah.
I'm an impact guy. I just feel so much impact in the work that we do.
Well, and what's interesting about the analogy you brought up is that there's two lenses that you could look at it through. But I think the one you highlighted is the right one, because you could look at it as, well, we have squeaky floors, we have the broken blinds, we have the toilet that we need to jiggle. And we could say, well, we just should replace that. But the reality is, in organizations, that's just the reality. It's just like your house. It's impossible for your house to ever not have some of this stuff. It's more about knowing where those things are.
That's
and how do you work with it? Because you don't pursuing it going, well, how do we just eliminate all of those issues? You don't.
I don't remember if it's a Drucker framework or whatever, but it's the 4 quadrants, right? Of the I know what I know what I don't know what I know, I don't know what I don't know. All I'm saying is, again, this idea of we need to start moving from the I don't know what I don't know to the I know what I don't know quadrant. As soon as you do that, that's actionable, right? That becomes something. Yeah, you can do something with that. Yeah,
that's just it. And I think even using that analogy, that's a really important thing, in that it's not about ignoring it or finding it so that you can make a massive change, because the reality is it's giving you the knowledge and the information to be able to make wise decisions. I just think about some of the things in our house that we let go because we've intentionally made the decision to say the effort to change, there's better ways we can solve it versus tearing down the house and rebuilding a new one.
Chris, you've spent a bunch of time in executive tables and different companies and things like that. I presume, have had to manage up, right, in the past?
Never.
But what is the thing that you manage up for, right? What is the thing you're really trying to keep in mind when you develop something for as a boss, leader, superior, right? You're trying to address the things that, generally speaking, keeps them up at night. And a lot of the time, effectively, you're especially as you go higher and higher and higher up the organization, the primary role of an executive table is actually risk management, right? It's not, it's not catastrophic, or not catastrophic, but astronomic growth. It's astronomic growth in the confines of risk management.
Risk, right.
And so when you said ignore, right? This is, my finance speak coming out, but there are some principles on risk management, right? You can't ignore, as you said, I love the word you chose. That's what got me on this tangent. You can't just ignore risk. You have to accept it or mitigate it, right? You can't just ignore it. You can't just cover yourself with blankets and pretend it's not there. And unfortunately, I think that's what we've done with people for a really long time.
This was a little bit of an unexpected hole we went down, but I'm actually really glad we did. And this is why I love talking to folks with lots of different backgrounds, because we bring different lenses to it. And that point you brought up about the risk piece is so important in this conversation, because to your point, I think this is what organizations have often done. It either feels too overwhelming, it feels too confusing, it feels too like, I don't know what to do with it. So it's like, let's just ignore it and hope it goes away. And that is one of the worst things you can do for risk, period, not just in an organization, but that's the worst thing you can do in life, because you have to accept there's risks associated with everything. It's a matter of being informed and doing something with it.
Yeah. And like measuring the risk of, because here's where I'll give some credit to folks who are doing, I mean, look, we're talking to a whole bunch of people today, and we'll hopefully have a whole bunch of listeners listening who are in this world day in and day out. Yes. What I don't think people are intentionally, I don't think people are intentionally waking up every day just being like, that's not a big deal. I think we sort of just either, I'll share two possibilities, probably more than two. Either we don't know how to measure it, or we just don't understand how big of a risk it is, right? So we sort of business value it away. We sort of say, well, we can't invest in that this quarter because shareholders or because funders or because whatever.
Yes.
Without necessarily being able to, we have all sorts of little stats, right? Well, how much does it cost to recruit a new employee, Chris? Some stats say up to 40% of the existing person's salary, right? How many months does it take for somebody to truly be onboarded? Well, some stats say it's for every $10,000 of salary, you can expect up to 6 weeks of onboarding time. Like there are some of these facts and figures, but again, I don't think anybody wakes up every morning intentionally ignoring those facts and figures, right?
I appreciate you making that clarification, because I think sometimes, right, I tend to do in hyperbole. But I think it's not this intentional thing. And to be fair, and this is why I'm so excited about this conversation and where the skills conversation is going, it has historically been very, very difficult. It's been time consuming. It's been resource intensive. And so it has been one of these things that has been extremely challenging, I think, for a lot of organizations to figure out what to do with it. And so when you can't quantify it, and you aren't even really sure what to do with it, as a result, sometimes then that just naturally goes to, well, I'm going to solve the fire that I can quantify and I can assess, versus the one that, boy, I just don't even have a category for it.
Yeah, bang on. And I think people are doing their best. And this actually goes back to the first part where because you're right, the problem has existed for a while. I think it's okay to call out that the pandemic sort of expedited so many of these challenges, right? We now have things like the Great Resignation, right? We have a term for people saying, I don't feel valued enough. I don't think the work that I'm doing is fulfilling enough. I wasn't used the correct way. I wasn't utilized the correct way. People didn't, especially coming out of, the George Floyd murder, and up here in Canada, we had, thousands, Chris, of unmarked graves of children found in what we used to call Indian residential schools, which was, there's a lot of social things happening alongside everything we were dealing with in the workplace, and people sort of reflecting and saying, hey, I spend 10 hours a day with my laptop or my work colleagues or whatever, and that needs to matter. And I think every organization has the potential to be purposeful, meaningful, and like places where people want to, work. And I think it really comes down to the micro, that old saying, right? People don't quit jobs so much as they quit leaders, right? Yep. 80% of people are really quitting their leader. They're not quitting their jobs. There's a lot of potential to just make people feel more seen and included in all those soft words. But again, like when we come back to this conversation, it's like, we know we help do that through this modicum of skills assessment. It sounds kind of silly to make such a big leap, right? To say, look, we help people feel more fulfilled at work. But, I'll just share a stat that I learned recently. One of my favorite HR consultancies. Sorry, Chris, competing, your competition, perhaps.
There is plenty of water in the ocean.
McLean & Co. is this, they did 50,000 exit interviews, something like 50,000 exit interviews last year. And fascinating research. Amongst the things they talk about is the top 5 reasons people leave organizations. Compensation was number 4 of the top 5, not number 1, right? It wasn't just throw more money at the problem. It was number 4. The other 4 reasons had everything to do with wasn't recognized for the skills that I had. I wasn't utilized to the best of my abilities. I didn't have enough opportunity to grow in my role, in my career. And I didn't feel like the workplace valued me as an individual. These are all people skills, competencies, sort of some DE&I. These are all those things, right? And we know that recruitment is, if not one of the most expensive functions of the HR HR function, functions of a function. And so we can get ahead of that, right? We can get ahead of that by just being better at assessing people's skills, utilizing them and growing them effectively. And honestly, it's not just and this is where I sort of wonder how much of learning and development. I'd love to hear if folks are watching and want to sort of share experiences in the comments, right? How much do they feel that oftentimes organizations use learning and development as a defensive strategy as opposed to a truly deeply strategic one, right?
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting, because I was going to go to defensible learning next, but I actually want to start with this piece for skills like around belonging and strategy first, because I think the defensible piece is important. I don't want to downplay it because it is an important piece, but I think sometimes that can be initially where we go to instead of going, there's something bigger to it. And you hit on it before around this point that solving this skill piece and being able to help people. And I think sometimes we focus just on the organizational side, but even for individuals as an individual to know what are your skills and capabilities, it's a win-win in terms of creating some of these opportunities to improve career development, to improve a sense of belonging, because you know who you are and what you bring to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like it's an everybody wins proposition, right? Because when people, what we often tell our customers, right, is you inherit this skills matrix on steroids, right? And so, I'll typically use silly examples. I don't have my cell phone with me, but typically I'll toss a cell phone back and forth, and I'll sort of say, look, if you're hiring a cell phone tosser, right, every job has a series of criteria, right? And so those criterias can be, maybe it's eye contact with the customer, while cell phone tossing, right? Maybe it's, having your elbow at a certain angle for health and safety prevention, injury prevention in the workplace or whatever, right? There's criterias to jobs. I mean, imagine as an organization, if you could understand all of the capabilities and levels of abilities of, elbow angles and cell phone tossing, so that when your business moves into the market of, coffee mug tossing, right, you actually really understand who might be the right people to, and maybe who's a little bit underutilized right now, or like who should we put on? Because typically what I've seen in corporations, both the ones I've been in and clients, right, it's often the same people who get asked over and over again, right? It's often right, and that's a whole bunch of untapped potential. Then we get to that people piece, which is the individuals then have this opportunity to, advocate for their own skills and also, feel that utilization, feel that respect, feel that inclusion, right? It's a big deal.
Well, and I think, and I want to unpack this a bit, because this is the part that I actually see learning and development as having a really unique opportunity right now to, in many ways, lead some of this, because I was on a panel recently talking about this. And one of the gaps that a lot of organizations have right now is that they aren't really sure. I just see a lot of organizations that, going back to this, people aren't intentionally ignoring risk, just like they're not ignoring potential. It's that there's a lack of understanding of what the real potential of some of this stuff is. And I think what you just described right there are some of the problems that are happening in the executive chairs, where they're going, man, we have a lack of skills in this part of the organization. How do we fill these roles with people? And they're pushing their talent acquisition teams to say, go find more of X person, because they don't really know what else to fill it with. And so as a result, they're like, find more of, Japman, because he seems to be a good performer. So can you find more of that?
Yeah.
It's like, right. But what makes Japman good? And you may actually have that in your organization if you started having visibility into this. So instead of trying to scour the marketplace, I saw a funnel today from recruiting where it's like 400,000 leads convert to a few thousand hires.
Mm-hmm.
That is a ridiculous funnel. And think about the value to an organization if you could start to say, well, what if instead of taking those 400,000 and converting them to a few thousand hires, what if we just repurposed some of the folks in the organization that aren't the ones that are always getting tapped, not because they don't have the skills, but fundamentally, we just don't even know either that they exist or what they actually bring to the table.
Yeah, I have to call out my former employer on this one, right? Longview Systems does an amazing job of this. And it's not to say that they never have had to let people go or lay off people, but they have a very principled intention to sort of say, if we do have to lay people off because maybe a client has left or maybe the division isn't, as successful as it once was, it's more traditional IT, we're going to retrain as many of those people for those next jobs inside the company, so that we don't throw them into, spiral them into that uncertainty of being unemployed, having to navigate, X, Y, or Z, whether it's family and health plans and all these types of things. We're going to redeploy. And also the organization wins, right? Because they're already culture fits. They've already been there. They know the politics and the organization. And so again, everybody wins, right? Like there's so much, it's hard to business value this stuff, but we have to, right? Because at the end of the day,
we have to.
Employers and businesses in particular are
and going back to what we said earlier on, executives' job is to assess risk and make decisions based on risk. So there has to be a value equation of, so how do we assess this risk to the organization? How do we assess the risk of laying off, which right now is happening everywhere?
Yep.
How do we assess the risk of what is the impact of laying all these people off versus reassessing their skills and finding out, is there actually opportunity? Because I don't know about you, but I've been in plenty of organizations where they go through these massive rifts and then about 90 days later or less, they're scrambling to hire because they realize we have now huge holes in the organization.
I mean, these things are cyclical. My heart goes out to everybody who is currently undergoing.
I agree.
I mean, I don't want to diminish how maybe tragic is too strong of a word, but how impactful that is, right? So, but it is also worth knowing and remembering that these things are in fact cyclical, and at a macro level, those jobs will come back, and they might come back in slightly different places, and there will be requirements for some upskilling and training and all these things. And so we will, so we will yet again come back to a place where we will be, 2.5 million jobs, or what was it? December 2021, there was 11 million job openings in the United States, right? December 31st.
Some ridiculous number. Yeah.
11 million. We have an anticipated shortage of 2.5 million data science, data analysts, data visualization people by 2035 or something. Like crazy numbers. I think I was reading a headline. Is the skills gap is an $85 trillion problem. $85 trillion. I will take 1% of it. No, I'll even be happy with 0.1 actually, as I do the math.
Yeah, I was going to say 1%. You didn't even need 1%. And you could retire back in Canada. There you go.
It's a massive business problem. That $85 trillion is, these are the amount of revenues that are going to be foregone if we don't solve the skills problem. It's a big problem.
Well, and what you said there, when you were talking about the cyclical nature of this is, and I think this goes back to this, and this is my math teacher days coming back out, where a lot of times we're doing the math without seeing the full equation. And so these risks are being assessed without actually understanding all the variables in the equation. So thinking about this cycle, organizations, a lot, because I've been through them many times where, like you said, it is tragic when organizations just riff out these things and the impact it has on the overall performance of the rest of the organization. Because when you start doing this, the rest of the company basically goes, am I next?
Yeah.
How long does this last? The people who get ripped out of the organization, regardless of how diplomatically you handle it, it's tragic and it crushes them and it changes your company brand. I mean, it has a massive impact on some of these things. And so when you just go back to saying, well, and now we just need to go back to this. This is an opportunity not to just magically fix this cycle, but to say there is opportunity to significantly mitigate this cycle that we have right now through doing this.
And that's some of the exciting work that we, ideally it happens in the organization so they can avoid doing the layoffs. The other piece of that is, and again, work that we do in North America and Europe, is around helping people walk away from that last job. And maybe this is the segue, Chris, is with some that idea of legally defensible skills from their last job. I like to call it the personalized highlight reel video, right? Where people can take this like sort of portfolio, which by the way, Vametric is the inventor of the e-portfolio, right? Robert Smart, my business partner and founder of Vametric.
Yeah.
He literally invented this e-portfolio concept back in 1994, like VHS era, right? Like there's some
pre-laser disc.
Yeah. Forget Blu-ray. Like this, we're talking VHS. Like it might as well have been beta, right? So, poor guy.
I watch too much regular show. So like all of this is just all coming back to me.
Poor guy's not here to defend himself, but I always like to remind him that he invented the portfolio when I was 8 years old. So it was a long time ago. It was literally Windows 3.1, right? Like this is what we're talking about. So in any event, right, to be able to walk back into the workforce with this, we really believe in this term, but it's a term that I can tell you stories about and tell the listener stories about, which is this idea of legally defensible skills, right? To a standard, to an industry recognized standard. It doesn't necessarily, I have a bunch of industry credentials. I won't knock them fully, but I think the idea is that I can pass an industry credential exam with a 71% and earn 100% of the credential. It kind of goes back to the risk thing again, which is like, I get 100% of the credential for failing 29% of the exam. And I don't know which ones I guessed and got right. So maybe it's even less than 71%.
Yeah.
And what's an employer to do in that situation? Look, he's got the PMP or he's got the Microsoft Azure this or the GCP, whatever that, or whatever, CompTIA, any industry search.
PhD. Really, I mean, whatever
even
it is,
PhD,
literally.
bang on.
Something like that.
But how do you turn that into information that's actionable by employers, both current, past, and future? And this is where that piece comes back to working with like the staffing types of agencies and working with the severance providers to sort of like help people mobilize their next job by creating these validated skills that they can advocate for themselves based on, opportunities in the market. Go ahead.
What I like about where we're going with this, because I want to keep unpacking this whole defensible, I'm going to call it legally defensible skills piece, is, a lot of times it's easy to look at this through the lens of the employer and what the benefit to the employer on this one. Here's the benefit to us in terms of what we can do with all of this. But what you just described in terms of, now I'm just going to have my VHS skill portfolio, right, that I can pull off the shelf and put in my VCR and play for folks. But it really truly is, because the reality is, going back to the mobility piece, there are times when organizations have no choice. It would be, again, assessing risk. They have no choice but to reduce their workforce. It's a decision that has to be made. It's the nature of business.
Mm-hmm.
However, what we're talking about here is by actually verifying and validating legally defensible skills, we're actually gifting our workforce something to set them up for greater success in what that next thing is, which not only is great for the employee, but it's also great for the employer, because it is a way of saying, no, we actually truly are committed and invested in you, and we want your success in what's next. We wish it could be here, but it can't. However, we want to provide you with this so that instead of getting really good at interviewing skills and whiz-banging people to believe you're great at stuff, you can actually go and say, here is what I am qualified, capable, and extremely talented at doing, so that they can go, perfect. So that even if you bomb the interview, who cares? Because we actually don't care as much about that, because we know you can actually do the thing we need you to do.
Well, and I'll bring this sort of piece up again, right? Growing up shockingly with my parents, what if your English as a second language and you're just not great at the interview, but when you produce that portfolio, you're the world's best cell phone tosser, right? what if that's the situation? What if you have like high anxiety, right? What if
I mean, all the neurodiversity stuff coming out, there's a lot.
Absolutely. Why can't we? I grew up watching up tier TSN, your ESPN equivalent, and watching Sports Center every morning, and I love the highlights. Why can't we all have highlights? Like, why can't we all do that? Right? Why can't we all be able to put ours? And that's the question we're answering, right? Like that we can.
We can. That's the thing. It's not a like pithy what if. Imagine a world where this is possible.
It's and you're right. Like there's an element of or a level of compassion that organizations could. And again, it's the everybody wins piece, right? There's a level of compassion that organizations can exercise by doing something like this, like you said, right? By enabling people who are leaving an organization to be equipped with something like this. On the flip side, if they decide to train and upskill, like imagine for the L&D leaders in the call, right? Like imagine being able to talk to your training provider and say, listen, great, you're going to send 50 or 10 or 20 or 100 of your employees to some training provider, insert, training provider here to do all of your corporate training for the year. Well, imagine if you also told them, hey, in order to be our training provider, you actually need to provide some validated assessments through Validate, ideally, to wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Check out the link. Idea. What if you could actually sort of work with your training provider and say, look, if you can do this, right? If you can do like validated assessments, I would be your customer for life. Like if you could prove to me that the 4 days that I sent Chris or Jutman away for some random training, that they're going to come back with skills we actually need in this organization. I mean, that's easy money, right? That's easy money and it puts power back in the hands of the learning and development team, right? And it becomes deeply strategic, right?
It becomes extremely strategic. And I think this is one of the things where for L&D leaders, this is where our appetite for driving this conversation, not only because, as you mentioned, and I think this is one of the things, sometimes I'll be in conversations and people go, well, sometimes we just have to make choices between, the business and the employee. And it's like, actually less than you think,
right?
Less than you think. There are opportunities where you can go, no, actually, like what we're talking about, the choice done right is actually in the best interest of both parties. It's a win-win for everybody. There's not this person has to lose so this person can win in order to be able to do this.
And this is these are the problems I love to sort of really dig into, right? Because I don't think every organization does this by any means, but I feel as though oftentimes the great folks working in HR and HR adjacent functions, their hearts are in the right place and they want to do right by people. Like the hearts are so full, right? These are such good human beings who want to do such good things. And I sometimes think that perhaps the organization, right, the business, which for some reason we don't include HR in, but the business, the business is like, okay, well, that's just that like soft HR stuff. So we'll do as much as we have to. And it's a blanket statement, huge generalization. But I guess what I'm saying is this is why I love digging into these problems, because, we can, we can equate the best possible ways to, take care of people with business value. We can do that. And again, I just sort of go back to like, this is why I get super jazzed up every morning, because I know that the opportunities to redefine how people are used and utilized for profit, right? Or if you're a for-profit, right? Like for the purposes of businesses to do better, grow more, or for the purposes of nonprofits to, generate additional impact or better funding, like we can do that. Like we can do that. We can do that together.
We can. Well, and what you hit on there that I actually think is a distinction and almost a step we need to take to step into this is you mentioned it, that a lot of times we talk about the business as separate, right? There's the business and then there's us doing this other stuff over here type of a thing. When in fact, getting into this space, actually you become one of the business stakeholders in many regards. And I think this is one of the, now we're not having a conversation of squishy, nice to have stuff. Now we're actually having a strategic business conversation. And we're coming to the table, not saying let's say we're dealing with an ops leader. Not saying I understand how to run your operations better than you do, but I do understand what to do with your people better than you do. And instead of competing and fighting with each other, going, no, we're both set out for the same thing. There's a skill and expertise and a business capability that I have to help you drive that forward so that you can focus on this. And I think to your point, people have the best intentions of some of
really
this,
do.
but sometimes what happens is it runs astray because we aren't coming to the table with this business operator hat in mind and thinking about the work we do in terms of tangible business stuff. I don't have a good word for it.
And it's tough, right? Like I know my peers oftentimes will sort of, other companies that are sort of navigating these types of spaces will try to ignore talking to HR at all. And that's too bad, right? Because that's too bad because again, these are some of the best people I've ever met at the end of the day, right? Like the people who are really like, they're just, and that's, I think one of the things I love about the space as well is like, I would have dinner with pretty much all of my clients, right? Like not for business development purposes. Like I would play board games.
No, like legit, like come over and we'll have a barbecue type thing.
Yeah. Like there's such good people trying to do such good things. And I get it. Like there's a tendency to sort of go to like the CFO's office or the COO's office, or the ops guys or the, whatever. And we do that too on occasion, but I guess all I'm saying is that like the people who are really running people organizations, I think, as you said, have the best intentions because look, they want to remain employed too. There's still people that are trying to pay their bills and feed their kids, right? Like, everybody's trying to do right by again, I don't think anybody wakes up with this active intention to be like, I'm going to screw over my employer or anything, right? So I think like, I hope not, but anyways, it's a bit of a tangent and a ramble. I just think that, there are ways to bridge this gap of, people versus business. And those are the conversations.
I think that's what's exciting about where this space is going is that it does give us a distinct attribute in the conversation. Because I think to your point, I think sometimes when we try and leave, I just see businesses, like you said, do this where they do either try and go directly through HR or learning, or they go, well, they just aren't getting it done. So we're going to go directly to the business leader instead. And there's risks going both ways. Yeah. If you go one route, you may miss some of that business acumen side of, well, how's it actually working? Or what are some of the strategic business priorities? You go the other way and you run the risk of business leaders don't always have that human-centered component, and that's not a squishy thing. So I think it is an opportunity, and that's where I push people in our field to say, this is actually, we keep saying we want a seat at the table. There has never been a better opportunity to have a seat at the table with something of significant, meaningful value to drive corporate strategy and have a sense of belonging at the table versus just being the token, people person at the table to go, no, I'm actually contributing to this in a really meaningful, strategic way.
I'm just going to cut that like last 15 seconds out and just use it as our marketing material. Because you're right. Look, you're right. Like to be able to drive value, again, for people, for organizations, and to do it in a way that's inclusive and to do it in a way that meets the current and future labor needs and demands. And, and again, this is just the organization side, but absolutely, there's a huge opportunity to do that. Good work. Like you said earlier, ocean's big enough for lots of people, right? Again, I just need 1% of that 85 trillion.
So I do want to transition to this because I'm really curious on this because this is where I see things. We talked about it a little in the beginning, where a lot of times where we've gone with the validation of skills is it really is based on, honestly, poor metrics. Like we said, well, you passed a test, you got 70%, so you got the full degree, and we're going to assume that means that everything in all the classes that you took and actually carried through and you know how to do it, or you have a certification, so you actually end up doing that. I'm curious, how are you approaching the validation of skills? Because to me, this has been one of the biggest black boxes for a lot of things over the years where I've seen people really try and crack this and they've struggled with it. So what does that look like for you but also speaking more broadly, like how do we move beyond, hey, you passed a test, or you passed an oral exam, or you did this one thing really nice, and so I'm going to assume the rest?
Yeah. So it goes back to that sort of cell phone toss example. We can do this with technical skills, with soft skills, with sort of in different, depending on your region, they might be called key skills or essential skills or power skills or whatnot. But basically our principle basically is that people are three-dimensional. Their assessments are often one-dimensional.
Okay.
How do we bring three-dimensional assessment to the table? But, because, let's go back to our university days for a sec, right? There is actually zero science anywhere that suggests that putting 1,500 students in a gymnasium in the middle of December is the right way to assess their knowledge and competence. And yet, December after December, universities around this country, and yours and mine both, and around the world, will do that. Final exams, 3 hours, high stakes exams, time boxed. If you talk to anybody, if you collaborate with anybody, we call that cheating. You get kicked out of the exam room. Right? And
the very thing we're trying to build skills in companies, which is how do you work together with people and collaborate? We're like, no, but if you do that, we're going to fail you.
That's right. We call that cheating. And it's laughable. Look, it is laughable, man. Like it's universities, colleges, lots of really cool things going on that are trying to reform the way we do assessment, because assessment then becomes a gatekeeper to whether or not a student can become a productive worker. If you don't get enough of those multiple choice tests right, you don't get the degree. Now, we're seeing a lot of things around skills-based organizations, skills-based hiring. I always ask the question quietly in my head, well, how? Like, how are people actually doing skills-based hiring? Like, again, this is not just meant to be a nonstop marketing pitch, but it's like, I know we help that conversation. How are others doing it? Because how do you give people credit for their server skills in a restaurant to then do customer support in IT? There's a lot of overlapping skills. I agree. We should do skills-based hiring, but how are people actually doing it? This is what I'm really interested in finding out more and more about, because we know that the world is moving to the skills-based way. So how do we do it? We take three-dimensional multimedia assessments. Again, not a brand new idea. We threw the idea of VHS tapes around, right? This idea of three-dimensional assessments then needs to be met with another critical component, which is they need to be auditable. They need to stand up under scrutiny. And so you take vocationally competent people, right? And they're assessing through Validate these three-dimensional pieces of evidence. But even that, right? Like, one of the big pluses to that whole multiple choice exam in the gymnasium thing is at the end of that exam, you just filter in the Scantron through the machine and it just reads everything. And look, your assessment is done. Wash your hands of that, take the mark, and off you go. And that next term starts, and just do it again with the next 1,500 students. So then our question became, how do we do this just as quickly? Because overarchingly, most of our market is 16 years and up, right? So predominantly adult learners, a little bit of sort of pre-apprentice workforce development type of stuff around youth engagement, CTE. And then adult learners going into corporate and sort of employers. The question is, how do you create these multimedia assessments that are super valuable for all of these stakeholders? And how do you do it in a way that you can grow and create career pathways, and you can grow and create these personalized highlight reels, and there's a million different credentialing possibilities in the United States right now. A million. If you're an 18-year-old, and I realize this is not necessarily the University College podcast, but there's a million different credentialing pathways right now.
It's honestly overwhelming. I know a lot of people who are kind of the Gen Z group coming up in this, trying to figure out, how do I actually navigate this? Because there are so many pathways.
And also, you're an executive or have been an executive at a healthcare organization, right, Chris? Yep. The question is, does that mean you could not be an executive at a fintech company or a bicycle manufacturer? I would say, of course you can, right? And so finding this ability, going sort of circling back, and so finding this ability to understand, well, what are the skills that just make you a good executive? What are the skills that make you good at customer service? So you can go from that restaurant job to that customer IT job. And how do we do that as quickly as possible? How do we how close can we come to matching the efficiency of throwing a Scantron into a machine and just reading it out? How close can we get to that level of efficiency? That's what Validate ultimately does. So you take all those pieces, right? Quick and efficient, fine. Auditable, super important. Multimedia assessments that are deemed to be vocationally competent by, again, assessors who are vocationally competent. And that sort of mix gives us what Validate does at the end of the day, is this idea that, this stands up under scrutiny. And now as an employer, you've effectively de-risked your entire recruitment or skills development process. You've brought it down next to zero. Right?
Well, and one of the things you just brought up is you highlighted some of the ways that you approach this, because I've heard it's very similar to some of the things that I've seen work really well in organizations before. And one of the challenges that I think is interesting that I see in organizations, and I think this sometimes comes up, is people always ask, well, can't we just do that internally? Can't we just do that internally? And I actually don't think you can, to be completely honest, because the things you described, and this is where, and this isn't necessarily just saying, so go sign up. Although I'm sure you would love me to say that, but I think there is
That's
this
another
point of,
half a second split that'll just take.
Yeah, there you go.
Sign up. Sorry, keep going.
Just take little snippets of this video and
out of context.
In reality, I have seen people try and build some of this out internally. And I've actually been an advocate saying, this is not something you want to try and do internally for so many of the reasons that you described, in that the level of consistency that you need, the ability to be consistent with how you're assessing, how do we make decisions on what these things are, so that, to your point of making them defensible. Well, it's not different if this person does it, and it's different over here. And then basically it's so inconsistently, you're back to, well, actually there's zero actual validation behind anything that we're doing. But that kind of stuff doesn't scale in a company. Most companies just are not, you can't scale that. And I think that is one of those things where I'm always advocating for, you actually need a strategic partner who's doing a good job at this, because they have the benefit of being able to really focus and do this really well, versus kind of duct tape and paper clipping something together, because it's like, well, that's all we really have time for. And so we're asking managers to assess their talent all individually, and we sent them a job aid. So hopefully that it just does not scale. It does not scale within an organization.
At the very least, it's deeply hard work, right? If you don't have parameters, right? It's parameters in place to help you do the work. I just feel like the amount of complexity, even just knowing what you do and knowing what the players in your space do, the amount of complexity and specialization that goes into it, there are very few things that I would go, no, you actually need a partner for this. And to me, this is one of those. It's like when people come and talk to me and they're like, well, what if we could get IT resources to rebuild some of these systems that are in the market instead of having to buy? And I go, why would you do that? The amount of specialty and specialization that you would need to do it really well, you cannot scale. And the effort you're going to put into it, going back to assessing risk and assessing value, it's not there. Yeah, that's a whole big bucket of worms too, right? Like coming from an IT background a little bit for a couple of years, right? It's like the build versus buy conundrum. There's always, there are definitely occasions where build makes more sense than buy.
There are occasions. I won't say there aren't.
They are rare, right? Like if your core job is cell phone tossing, why are you also now bolting on software development to your cell phone tossing job, or to your cell phone tossing core go-to-market thing? And to work with partners, again, easy to get all sales pitchy here, but I think at the end of the day, you need to work with partners that want to get to know your business, and that's, again, like what sales guy doesn't say that. But I think there is a point where, I fundamentally agree with you. Assessment is hard work, and you need
hard.
help. It needs to
and
be
it's
done.
deep skill. It's deep skill. I mean, we're talking about skills, but the skill in assessment and validation, that's a deep skill.
In
That's
Europe,
not something that you're like, well, I've done some stuff, so I can probably figure that out.
There's a credential for assessing in Europe.
That's what I'm saying.
Not in North America. Now, luckily, we were born and raised in Europe. We got, we're gonna hit 15 million users by the end of. We're gonna hit at least 15 million users by the end of 2024, and we were built on the back of some really interesting work that started in the UK when competency, skills, apprenticeship, the de facto way to learn, and Robert, thanks to his vision, foresight, knowledge, and just some really, really good bets, has been at the heart of that. And so we know we have an expertise to lend on this problem, which helps make it easier. I don't go as far all the time, Chris, to sort of say you need to have the assessment take place outside of the organization. The reason, and again, I sort of, you've been doing this a lot longer than I have, but I sort of look at, when I bring it down to the micro problems, is bring it back to the house analogy. When you got a leaky faucet, maybe your first call isn't always to a plumber. Maybe your first task is, why don't I go look on YouTube and sort of see who's had a similar problem and see how they fixed it. And so that idea that you can sort of assess it yourself and go after something yourself is possible. But I agree with you fundamentally, which says that alone, though, like that doesn't mean you should build a thing inside of your company. You can use us as an example, but idea is you can use a partner to facilitate that function. You don't, if you feel like there's a trade secret that you can't just outsource to an assessor.
No. And so I actually see, this is where I actually like the debate piece where we kind of go back and forth, because it helps me clarify my point on this. And I think your example, the house example, actually really beautifully illustrates this, because it's not, my position on this would not be, there is nothing you can do, just relegate and kind of like pass it off. I actually would say that's foolish, because you actually do need to know your organization. You need to know the challenges. You need to lean in deep. There's still a heavy part that you have to be involved in. And can you get started? Like you said, with the faucet, if you have a leaky faucet, the reality is I don't know an organization in the world that just has a leaky faucet. And I think that's the problem. We've got organizations where the basement is flooded and all the pipes in the house are dripping through the walls. And it's like, well, is it possible for us to YouTube this? And I go, no, no, do not try and YouTube your skill assessment validation piece, because the bottom line is there is a lot of work ahead. Now, does that mean you just like sit back and wait for the plumber to show up? No. But I think that's one of those, like, we've got and I mean, like you said, it's a multi-trillion-dollar problem.
Wild.
The house is flooded. Water's pouring out of everything. And that's not something you want to YouTube.
Here's the empathy piece that I think I sort of have with it is, do you know who thinks it is a leaky faucet? The business, right? And so the business, and this is where I sort of go back to why I love talking to the L&D and the HR functions, is like, these folks probably like you understand there's a lot of work to do, but that doesn't mean the appetite will be there for the budget approvals and things like that. And this is the journey, right? This is why this problem will not go away, by the way. This is why this problem, we've got 30% of the workforce expected to retire in the next 10 years. This problem's not going away. Like this problem is still, generative AI and all these things that are going to sort of hopefully reduce the need for people. Well, first off, I hate the word hopefully in that sentence, but point being is that, organizations will always have a labor challenge. New types of jobs will arise as a result of things like generative AI.
Oh yeah, the work's never done.
The work's never done. So this problem is still just beginning. So,
and I think that is a great point to kind of close on, is that the opportunity, like you said, I don't think everybody realizes the basement is flooding and water's pouring out of all the pipes. And I think that's the opportunity. There's a greater awareness rising that it is becoming this, but we've also got to take into consideration a lot of the people in those decision-making chairs are also the people that are like, yeah, but this is something that I probably won't. Right? I'm in the end of my season. It may not be something I personally, so it's not necessarily as personal as for the folks that are coming up. And I think this is where the opportunity lies to help drive this and make everyone realize just how much water's in the basement.
Totally agree. And certainly never trying to sell against myself. I guess what I'm saying is I have a lot of empathy for the decision-making process.
Yes.
I realize we're going to wrap up here, Chris. If you don't mind me taking 30 seconds, I just want to quickly make a quick acknowledgement here. So up here in Canada, it's December 6th, as it is in most places in the world right now. Today is a pretty important day in Canadian sort of history, if you will. In 1989, on this day, 15 women were shot and killed at a polytechnic, sort of a community college in Montreal. Now, working in education, I sort of say this is sort of my responsibility to sort of call some of these things out. Today is the National Day of Action and National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. There's really nothing more to say other than look, hug your loved ones closer. But we continuously need to work on more equity. We continuously need to work on more inclusive spaces, and we're just trying to do our part in the way that we can. So,
and I think this is a fantastic way to take some action to this. So hopefully everyone who listens and watches this is seeing how some of these pieces fit together, because they are all interconnected. They aren't disparate from each other.
That's what we believe too. Yeah.
I appreciate you making the time to join, and I'm so glad we were able to get this in 2022. And thank you so much for being here. Thanks for the conversation. Thanks everybody for listening. And I hope you have an absolute fantastic week. Thank Japman for joining me.
Thank you for having me.